Hurricane Katrina devastated major cities across the eastern side of the United States and left 1,833 people dead and many more people without a place to live. The storm destroyed houses, buildings, and overall lives. In total, the storm caused $108 billion in damage. After the hurricane hit, many people had no choice but to leave their houses and evacuate elsewhere, thus forming the migration after Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was first seen in the Bahamas on August 24, 2005. It was a result of a tropical wave in a previous tropical depression. However, by then it was only seen as a tropical storm. Only hours after it developed into a hurricane, it reached the borders of Florida, only one of the states the hurricane would soon hit after only spending 6 hours on land. Max Mayfield, a meteorologist, was able to predict the path of the hurricane almost to perfection. He was able to tell when and where the storm would hit, as well as the size and the devastation it was likely to cause. Mayfield then personally called the governors of the states involved with Hurricane Katrina, allowing them to prepare and to help their state's citizens evacuate and to inform them of what was going on. To prepare for the storm, the governors that were now aware of the destruction Hurricane Katrina would likely cause allowed them to make evacuation plans for those in the path of the hurricane. They were able to ensure the safety for the people and save a large majority of the population with a short time span. However, some were very unfortunate and found themselves caught in the storm's destruction, leaving a majority of victims without a home, a job, and hope for the future.
The storm mainly hit states across the eastern side of the United States. This would include Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Ohio. In return, the storm devastated beaches along most of these states. The storm gave the worst impact along the coast of Louisiana and New Orleans, where the eye of the storm finally struck land. A total of 1,833 people were killed in the hurricane, but the number changes within various sources. Considering this, many people are still counted as missing today. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall, a large majority of the population, primarily in New Orleans, took shelter in the Superdome, which at the time was the only safe place around to take shelter in. The Superdome made way as a temporary living space for those who were caught in Hurricane Katrina and no longer had a home to go to. The Superdome was able to sustain the high wind pressures and heavy rainfall, but still received some damage, and even the roads that surrounded the area were flooded to about 5 feet. Most of the people who took shelter here were those who lived in poverty, and were the closest to the place of threat during the storm. Most of the damage from this hurricane took place in New Orleans, Louisiana. The people who were living near supposedly sturdy levees near Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Bourg that were not meant to withstand a storm as impactful as Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5, also lived in the area where most of the destruction was to take place. About 10,000 people took shelter in the Superdome, while 80% of the population had already evacuated, and the rest stayed in their houses to wait it out at home. During the time the storm hit, many of the levees were overwhelmed by the high winds and heavy rainfall, so in return, the levees no longer supported the city. Most of the people who had made their way to the Superdome were those who had houses near the levees and needed to evacuate before they were taken into the storm. Others who were able to evacuated just in time to stay with other family that were living in other states. After the storm hit, entire roads and neighborhoods had been wiped clean and flooded. Communities had no choice left but to pick up what they had managed to save and flee the area.
Hurricane Katrina was one of the deadliest hurricanes to hit the United States. Millions of people were left homeless because of the flooding that had occurred. The population of the places affected went down by 79%, and 70% of the houses were destroyed. Most people who had their houses destroyed had nowhere else to go because they had been in their hometowns for ongoing generations. Some people were fortunate enough to have relatives in other states, but most of those who had their houses destroyed realized the rest of their immediate family was in the exact same situation. Most people who were hit couldn't go back to their ordinary lives because they couldn't afford to build their houses or let alone build up their lives back to the way that they were before the hurricane due to the levels of poverty. Many people had to temporarily move away from the places they called home because the storm displaced more than 1 million people along the Gulf Coast. This forced them to enroll their children into new schools and look for a new well-paying job. Right after the hurricane hit and people were being rescued, people who were being taken away in helicopters were shipped away from the part of town that was devastated by the hurricane. They were put on buses and were shipped to other parts of the state that were unaffected, and some were even sent to larger cities around the area such as Houston. Many people were forced to live and start a new life where they were aware that sources would be available to them. One of the most common places that they migrated to was in Harris County, Texas, and Houston, primarily because this was the main place victims of the storm were sent to for help. 220,000 people sought refuge here because Texas was the closest nearby state that was directly avoided from the devastating hurricane. This was where the victims were offered necessary things such as water and food. Some of these cities became overpopulated with hurricane victims, and it seemed that if they were shipped further out into the country, more resources would become available to them. Hurricane Katrina caused oil production and refining operations to halt, which dominoed, making the gas and energy prices soar. It also caused damage to the nation's shipping industry. It led to the need of rebuilding that would take over a decade to accomplish, and it had many places that were deemed uninhabitable. It caused about 430,900 jobs to be lost in total. The lasting economical effects of Hurricane Katrina is the oil industry. Even with offshore oil production, it could not be made up for.